Hi there, everyone. I hope that you're all doing very, very well. We're going to transition to the final talk of the conference. I hope that you've all had as much fun as I have getting to make some new friends and getting to spend some time talking to some old ones. It's been a great joy to get to spend the past couple of days with you all in this beautiful, not super sunny today, but sunny yesterday, Florida weather. If we haven't met, my name's Colby Wicker. I study law and public policy and history at Indiana University. I'm a senior. This coming fall, I'll be attending the Indiana University's Maurer School of Law, but don't tell them that yet because I'm still fighting with them for some scholarship money. Hoping to get that squared away here soon. I invite you all to settle into this keynote session portion of this tonight. Tonight we'll receive an engaging talk from Dr. Ben Storey. Afterwards, my colleague and new friend Natalia will join Dr. Storey and I on stage, and we'll ask him some questions before opening up the mic to all of you. I'll let Natalia introduce herself more when she comes up on stage here in a little bit, but from the little time I've met her, I can certainly tell you she's dedicated, she's insightful, and she's almost certainly going to rule the world someday. So listen to what she has to say. Now, to tee up the ball for what Dr. Storey is going to talk to us about this evening, I've been thinking that, you know, we are a busy bunch living in a busy time. Constantly running to classes, shaking hands, getting LinkedIn connections, exiting ourselves off of a Zoom meeting only to hastily hop onto another one and apologize for being late. It can pull so much out of us. And it's no surprise that in this frenetic world, it's hard to find a respite, to find peace. As many of us approach the end of a long and hard-fought journey, I'm excited to introduce to you all a leading scholar on the epidemic of restlessness in our society. Tonight, he will give us some advice as we examine the open doors before us and choose what's next. Dr. Ben Storey is a senior fellow in social, cultural, and constitutional studies at AEI. Any reputable outlet of note has been graced by Dr. Storey's pen. He is concurrently a research fellow at the Civitas Institute at UT Austin, a Tocqueville Scholar at Furman University, the Jane Gage Hipp Professor of Politics and International Affairs, and the director of Furman's Tocqueville Problem. After hearing how busy Dr. Storey is, I'm sort of confused why he's talking to us about restlessness, to be honest, but I'm sure he will have some good things to say. In 2021, Dr. Storey and his wife co-wrote a book entitled Why We Are Restless that we all picked up on the modern quest for commitment, which Natalia and I both read in preparation for this talk. In short, it's an examination of the commentary of four French thinkers over time on how they've tried to find happiness and find the meaning to life. I'm sure many of us are here asking the same question, what should I be doing with my life? So with that, I hand it over to Dr. Storey for what I'm sure will be an engaging talk.
Hi, you all. So I'm your after-dinner speaker, and I understand that the person who had this job last night was my colleague, Jonah Goldberg. And when I was at an AEI conference a couple of years ago, and Jonah gave the funniest speech I've ever heard in my life. And so I want to begin by setting expectations properly. I am nowhere near as funny as Jonah Goldberg. I just want, and I say that I hope you hear the most pure and unadulterated envy in the tone of my voice as I tell you this. And so I'm not going to be able to break you up like he does. Anyway, it's wonderful to be with you all. It's wonderful to be back among college students. I was a college professor for 17 years. And while the job I have now as a senior fellow at AEI is like the coolest job in the world, I do miss spending my time among college students. And so it's great to be here with you all and to get to have a conversation together. So it's also particularly important to me to be here at the University of Florida and at Hamilton, under the auspices of the Hamilton Center, because the Hamilton Center bids fair to be the epicenter of a genuine renaissance in the field of liberal education, which I care most deeply about, and the whole field of higher education more generally. And so it's very exciting to be here at the beginning of something that I think is going to be really important as time goes on. It is a renaissance in higher education and liberal education is necessary. Higher education is in a crisis, in my view, of its own making. That is totally unprecedented in my lifetime, and I think since the end of the Second World War. Americans absolutely love college. We have built colleges like no country ever in the world. We've got this is America is sometimes described as a land of colleges. We just like sort of plant them everywhere we go. But public opinion is turning against higher education in really dramatic ways that have been documented over the last decade or so. Colleges are facing a demographic crisis. There just aren't as many students coming, and so they're going to be dealing with enrollment problems over the course of the next couple of years. And of course, they're facing political scrutiny to a degree that they have not faced any time, at least since I have been alive, as all of you saw in the hearings over anti-Semitism in Congress in the fall. So this is a really extraordinary moment. It genuinely, the word crisis is dramatically overused, but this really is one. This is a really significant thing that is going on in the world of higher education. And that's something that I think bodes both well and should worry us. In other words, there's a lot that needs to change, in my view, about the world of higher education, but there's also a lot of good. And there are a lot of things that, and in the course of this period of really profound change, I'm concerned that some of the good things about higher education are going to be lost. That includes particularly our tradition of liberal education. Liberal education is a very old American tradition. It goes all the way back to the founding. The first college, does anybody know the first college founded in the United States? It's pretty easy. It's Harvard, and it was founded in 1636, which is interesting because, of course, the Puritans arrived in Massachusetts in 1620, and if you think about the date 1636, that means they founded Harvard in time to educate the first generation of children born to them on this continent. Many other institutions of higher education, like William and Mary and St. John's College and Yale, all of these places were founded before the American Revolution. They were before the writing of the Constitution. And it's actually very hard to imagine a country that governs itself with reference to those kind of learned documents. A country wouldn't do that if it wasn't a place that honored higher education and, in particular, liberal education. And so, but in the crisis that is coming, one of the things we're going to see is that, look, the engineering departments, they're going to be fine. Great state flagship institutions like the University of Florida, it's going to be fine. What's going to die? Little liberal arts colleges. I was on the phone the other day with the president of one of these places. He's trying to save it before it goes under, and it doesn't look very good. What else is going to die? Places like English departments, philosophy departments, places that are the core of the liberal arts. So again, I think this is a problem that is mostly of the colleges and universities' own making. I think they have largely done this to themselves. And they're going to have to make a case. Liberal artists are going to have to make a case for the relevance of what they do to the interests of the rising generation. And so I want to try to make something of that kind of case tonight as to why people like you, people like eventually your children, should go on and do this, should get a liberal education when you get one. Hopefully what I'll be describing is some of what's already gone on in the course of your educations. Hopefully it will go on for you in the rest of your lives. But I want to try to offer the kind of case that would interest young people like you, young people rising now, in the kind of thing that a liberal education should offer. So I want to think about the landscape that we're living in and what it demands of young people. What would make liberal education attractive to people living in a world like that? So what is the cultural landscape? I think young people today look up, and what they see is a lot of adults arguing with each other who can't seem to agree about anything. The older generations don't seem particularly competent particularly capable of running things in an effective way. Young people are saturated in apocalyptic predictions about the disasters that are looming in everything from the climate to geopolitical questions. And this is a world that is almost totally devoid of anything that looks like authoritative guidance, good direction on what you should do with your life. And so I want to try to describe this evening how a liberal education can offer that to you, and offer that to you in a way that is not dogmatic or prescriptive. And so what I'm going to do over the course of this talk is, first of all, talk about the kind of guidance I think students typically get on our college and university campuses and why it doesn't actually do what they need them to do. And I think the problem with the kind of guidance that students typically get is that it keeps what's rational and what people desire in separate compartments of their lives. Second, I want to show how the kind of conversations that go on in the liberal arts classroom are, that kind of conversation is uniquely suited, I think, to encourage the development of the capacity for rationally reading the world, which can be taken inward, brought into conversation with my own desires, and help me live a better life, help me find a life that is fitting for me to live in the time and place that I find myself. So, in this sense, it seems to me that to be a teacher of the liberal arts is to practice a certain kind of chaste and reverent love for one's students that helps them develop certain habits of soul, the habits of being alert and carefully reading myself and the world in which I find myself so as to choose my way through it intelligently. Okay, so in this sense, a genuine liberal education can offer us guidance by helping us build up these kinds of habits of soul without telling us exactly how we should live. And so that's what I want to try to describe over the course of this talk. So I want to begin by describing something of the standard models of guidance that university students encounter these days, and explain a little bit about why I don't think they are any good. And the standard models of guidance that I think university students today encounter can be sorted into the categories of the checklist and the inner voice. So as Colby mentioned, I spent a long time as a college professor, and in that role, I was also an undergraduate advisor. And I advised dozens of students over the course of the years. And the first thing I would do when I met them was hand them a checklist, their guide through the GERs, the general education requirements, which are supposed to add up to their liberal education. For those who stuck with me, I would later on give them another checklist, this one their guide through the Bachelor of Arts. So this is a very standard, I would actually give out pieces of paper, probably it's all online now. In any case, it's a very standard piece of guidance that university authorities share with the young to guide them through their educations. So, and the young, as I found, typically like this. And they like it for the reason that it offers them sort of a rational and sequential way to account for their educational progress, right? So it's like, you're sitting there, you're looking at the thing, you're like, first year seminar, check. Intermediate Spanish, check. Politics 101, aha. That one I got before I even arrived on campus by taking AP Government in high school and notching a 5 on the exam, in case you were curious. And it satisfies both a general education requirement and a major requirement. Double check. This is very, very satisfying to go through a checklist like this. And I think that the checklist is so satisfying that I think it's one of the reasons that, that so many students now organize their educations in terms of 2 or 3, or even, I met one guy who had 4 majors, right? Because then every class you take counts for something. All of them fit on a checklist. Now, in my own life, like, there were a couple of courses that I took in college that were just elective courses. I just took them because they looked interesting. And so I would tell students, like, well, you should just, like, page through the catalogs. And there were a couple of courses these courses that I took just because they looked interesting, they turned out to be turning points in my life. They changed everything for me. And so I would tell students this, you should just take an elective. I mean, you should just do something because it looks interesting to you. And they would look at me like I was slightly nuts, and perhaps even suggesting something somewhat immoral, like going to a dive bar. This is the extent to which the sort of the checklist kind of dominates the landscape of undergraduate education. So the problem with the checklist, and even though people like it, is that it doesn't measure what it says it's going to measure. Your GER checklist is supposed to measure your liberal education. Now think about some of the people who are the great exemplars of liberal education, like Socrates, or like Catherine of Siena, or like Martin Luther King Jr. These people had these extraordinary qualities of soul, this tremendous openness combined with this extraordinary firmness and courage. Sitting through Spanish class and taking a multiple choice exam does not measure the acquisition of these kinds of qualities. So the problem with the checklist is that it's a desiccated kind of reason. It's too far from your inner life to actually check whether you were really getting a liberal education. So I think educational authorities know this, and so they supplement the checklist with another sort of mechanism of guidance or tool of guidance, which is the inner voice. So if you're like me, at some point in the course of your education, you've been having a conversation with some educational authority in your life, a teacher, a guidance counselor, somebody like this, and they've said to you, and you've been talking to them about what you're going to do with your life, and they've said to you something like this: that is a question that only you can answer. You have to follow your own star. You have to be your true self. You have to get in touch with the real you. The cliches pile up like jackknife tractor trailers on I-95. So this is the thing to which they're constantly referring to us. They're telling us that we need to listen to the inner voice. The inner voice, I think, is supposed to be kind of like, the muse that the ancient poets evoke, that, was the source of their songs. It's this authoritative divine command that comes to you and tells you exactly what to do, but doesn't explain itself as to like why you should be doing that. I think if one has a good inner voice, it should sound something like the basso profundo voice of James Earl Jones or Morgan Freeman or something like this, and just command you in a way that you couldn't possibly think of resisting exactly what to do with your life. So the educational authorities in my life told me that I should listen to the inner voice, and I tried to obey them. And so I went home and I did a little internal examination. I tried to see what was going on in there, and what I found was that I had desires and I had questions and I had a kind of inner psychic turmoil, but I did not, in fact, have an inner voice. I seem to be inhabiting a model of the human being that they failed to install this basic piece of navigational equipment at the factory or something, because, I just didn't seem to have it. So I talked about this for a lot of years with many students, and some of them said they had inner voices. Their inner voices seemed to me to sometimes say some surprisingly conventional things. From the time I was born, I've wanted to be an international human rights lawyer. Yeah. Now, some of them don't have inner voices, and some of them will notice this fact and fake it. I've got an inexplicable attraction to venture capital or something like this. The others, though, will own up to this fact, and they will start to ask hard questions of their education, because they're in institutions that still to this day promise a liberal education. They'll start to say something like, what is there going on at this place that might allow me to put my reason in conversation with my desires, that might allow me to see more clearly what I actually want out of life, that would do what liberal education promises to do, which is be the education of a free person, a person who can navigate his or her way through the world intelligently. That's the promise of liberal education. So I think liberal education can live up to that promise, but it's not by means of the checklist or the inner voice. The one is too external, too focused on these simple checklist measures. The other is just too irrational, right? Just desire that doesn't give an account of itself. So how can this happen? How can your desires, what you want out of life, your guidance, your internal guidance, become more intelligent over the course of a college education? I think the way that this happens is by means of the distinctive kind of conversation that goes on in the liberal arts classroom. So I want to try to describe that conversation for you and what I think it can do for human beings. So if you will, picture with me a moment a college classroom, relatively small one. You know, at the college where I taught, it'd be a dozen students. At a place like the University of Florida, maybe a small one is like 35. Yeah, but a relatively small group of people. The students come in, it's the first day of class, they don't know each other very well, and so they're all feeling rather awkward. So what do? They sit down, and one girl, she whips out her cell phone, and she starts scrolling and tapping very intently so as to demonstrate to everybody around that she's doing very important things. And other students around her notice this, and they're like, oh, that works. Right? That's a way for me to get away from the awkward stares of all these strangers around me. So they whip out their cell phones and they start doing the same thing. There's one young lady who's a little more cheerful and bold than the others. And so she's sitting next to another girl, and she turns to her and says, I like your shirt. And so the two girls, and they talk about where the girl bought it. And the two girls, they sing the praises of this store together. And then there's a dude who looks a little sleepy, and he says to the guy sitting next to him, I hate morning classes. And the guy sitting next to him says, no, I hate morning classes. I hate them even more than you. So what are these people doing? They're mirroring one another. And this is a very old form of human behavior that we engage in, particularly when we're uncomfortable and we don't know what we should do in the room that we've walked into. There are neuroscientists who talk about this. They talk about mirror neurons, and they'll describe how like babies start to sort of reflect back the faces of their mothers when they're too young to speak or think or anything like this. The philosophers have been talking about this for a long time. They talk about mimesis, the imitation, the way that Plato has a great description of this. He talks about people gathered together in a theater, and they all cheer and boo at the same stuff. They imitate the behavior of one another. And that's a very natural way that human beings have of relating to each other. So what happens that's distinctive in a college classroom happens when the prof comes in. And what the prof does, if he's a good prof, or she's a good prof, they give to the students an object of contemplation, something that they're going to try to understand together. This could be lots of different things. It could be a mathematical problem. It could be a piece of music. Some of my own favorite classes as an undergraduate were music history classes. It could be an animal specimen. There's a famous Harvard biologist named Louis Agassiz who would take his entering graduate students and just have them look at a fish for a week. It could be my own personal favorite, which is an ancient piece of text. The important thing about this is that it changes the dynamic among the students because you get, instead of just looking at one another, thinking just about myself and the other people around me, all of us join together in a common activity, which is interpreting some third thing in the world. And so the professor uses the very distinctive kind of authority that he possesses as a professor to encourage a certain kind of change in mind or soul or spirit in his students. Let me describe it. So first of all, let me just talk for a second about the authority of a professor. It's a really distinctive thing, right? There are lots of authorities in our world. Some people get authority because they've been elected. Some people get authority because they're very rich, or they're beautiful, or they're strong, or they're all kinds of reasons that we accord people authority. We accord professors a specific authority of reason, right? Because they're really trained thinkers. What they do in a classroom, if they if they do this business well, is use the mirroring tendency that we were talking about a minute ago, the mirroring tendency that human beings have towards one another, but they shift it. They get people to start using their minds to puzzle through the world. So, give you an example of this. You know, if you're a professor and you're sitting in front of a class and students are trying to understand some object, and they get it wrong, you have to correct them. But you also want to encourage them, get them to go a little bit further with the kind of thing that they're doing. When they get it right, you want to affirm them. Say, yes, good. Can you say another sentence about that? Because what you're doing when you do this is you're bringing forth a certain part of students' character. You're bringing forth their minds, the part with which they read and interpret the world. You're making that stronger and changing the dynamic of their relationship to one another. And so what will happen in a group like this after a certain period of time is the kids will start to relate to each other in a different way, right? You'll start to appreciate the fact that one of your fellow students shows you something about the world that you never would have seen for yourself, right? They bring different experiences to the table. They've got a certain power of rational interpretation that allows them to see the world more clearly than you do. And so you start appreciating one another for this, and that also strengthens this faculty of your mind. So the most important thing that liberal education does is provide students with a certain kind of love, a love for a distinctive part of themselves, a love for the minds with which they interpret the world, their capacity for, as the philosopher Lewis Strauss put it, articulating the riddle of being. You come to appreciate people for being good at that. That's what that kind of conversation involves. And this is not just something that goes on between professors and students, it's between students do this with one another. So I have certain friends from graduate school, and which I finished 20 years ago. And I'll get back together with them, and we jump right back into the same game of interpreting the world together that we were playing when we were graduate students. Okay, so the liberal arts classroom can use the mirroring capacities that human beings always have, deploy them in this very special way to get them to lead themselves with the mind as they're making their way through the world. And that's, this is the kind of thing that could go on in lots of different circumstances. But the college and university campus is really propitious for it because you have the rational authority of the professor that can be used to develop the reason of the minds, of the reasonable element of the character of his students. So this kind of conversation that you have in the liberal arts classroom is something that can be internalized. And when you internalize it, you can develop a conversation between your minds and your desires. And that is what ultimately allows you to better navigate the world. So I want to try to describe how this kind of internal conversation can work with the help of one of the philosophers you might read in classes like you take if you were a student in Hamilton, in the Hamilton Center, Thomas Aquinas, a great medieval philosopher, wrote a wonderful book called The Treatise on Happiness. And what Thomas Aquinas does in the Treatise on Happiness is that he looks at all the things that people typically long for, and he asks them whether they can, he asks those things, whether they can make us happy. And so when you take the capacity for rationally reading the world that you can develop in the classroom, you turn it inwards, you start to take your own desires more seriously. You demand things of them. You ask them to make themselves articulate, to explain themselves. You look at the objects of your desire and you say, what could that actually give me? What sort of role could it have in my own pursuit of happiness? So I want to take as an example one of the most common human desires, a desire that I think almost everybody has, which is the desire for wealth. Interestingly, so, I think almost everybody is interested in this. And interestingly, Thomas Aquinas, who took a vow of poverty, takes the desire for wealth really seriously. He asks the question that I think comes to all of us: can wealth make me happy? And his answer to it maybe somewhat surprisingly, is actually yes, even though he took a vow of poverty. But he tells us that wealth can only make you happy in a certain way and to a certain extent. And I think the way that he arrives at this conclusion is by taking the desire for wealth really seriously and asking it, just what do you want? What is the desire for wealth for? So when you say you want to be wealthy, what's the center of that desire? The center of that desire is money. So what's money? Money is a kind of universal tool. It's a pick that fits every lock, right? You can trade it in for almost anything. So, right, if you've got a lot of money, you can buy yourself a latte, or you can buy yourself a Lexus, or you can take a vacation in Florence, or you can buy a University of Florida education, or you can buy food for your family, or you can buy medicine for your father in his old age. I try to remind my kids of that one so that they will tend to it when I get just a few years older than I am right now. So the money is this universal thing that can buy all kinds of stuff. And some of that stuff is clearly serviceable to a rational vision of the good life, right? Like, being able to take care of your family, being able to get an education. These are things that I think we could give a very good argument are actually good for a human being. So the Thomistic answer, Thomas's answer to the question, can wealth make you happy? It's like, well, yes, as long as you understand that what it is an exceedingly useful tool and nothing more than that. But sometimes we fall in love with wealth in a different way. Sometimes we just like to contemplate the spectacle of an amply laden bank account. Now, this is a spectacle I have to use my imagination to contemplate because I spent most of my adult life as a college professor at a little school in South Carolina. It didn't pay that well. But we'll do so. So what is the pleasure of just thinking about having a big pile of money? I think the pleasure is the contemplation of possibility, right? I could turn this money into all these different things. It could be a nice apartment in New York. It could be a Lear jet. It could be who knows what that I could do with this money. And that possibility, that potentiality, is something that human beings are powerfully drawn to, right? So you see this also. There's another form of possibility that's really seductive to human beings. It's youth. So when you talk to really impressive young people, like the ones who work at AEI or many of the people in this room, they've been told all their lives that they have so much potential. And it's a very seductive thing because you think like, I could be a human rights lawyer, I could be in venture capital, I could do all kinds of different interesting things with myself. And it's fun just to be able to do many different kinds of things. I once had a student say to me, somebody with a lot of potential, he said, the thing I hate most of all is spending my chips. That is, converting all this potential of his into anything in particular, right? Choosing to go work in the Senate, for example, as opposed to choosing some intern in a big law firm or something like that. He had to pick. And that was very painful to him. So what we love when we think about just having a lot of money, what we fall in love with is just a spectacle of potentiality. Right? But you'll notice, I bet all of you have known people who dedicate their lives to the pursuit of money, who assume it to be their highest good. And what you'll notice is that their lives turn a little bit gray. That is, when they're talking to someone, they're not really talking to the person in front of you. They're thinking about whether this conversation could be the key to the next big deal. And if it's not, they're not very interested. Or people will say, I want to make a lot of money, but it's to support my family. But then they'll be sitting at the dining table with their families, not paying attention to the family that is there assembled at the table, but thinking about the spreadsheet that is back in the office with all those ones and zeros in it. And so when we focus on potentiality at the expense of actuality, we actually give up all the really good things in life. In order to get anything, you have to get something in particular, and that's what potentiality excludes. So the ancient Greeks had a wonderful story about this. It's, of course, the fable of Midas. Midas was a very talented businessman. Everything he touched turned to gold, but that turned out to include his own daughter. And so the fascination with potentiality is a kind of disordered love, as Thomas Aquinas would see it. So this is when we take the kind of conversation that we learn to have in the liberal arts classroom, and we draw it inward, and we use it to interrogate our own desires, what we can do is figure out exactly what they want and whether the things that we want could actually give us the happiness that is the overall goal of our desires. And when we do that, we are able to assign those things a fitting place in our lives. And it is the search for the fitting, which is a word I've used a couple of times, that I want to describe as the overall standard that a liberal education ought to make you better at finding as you try to choose your way through life. So this is a word that I've used a couple of times over the course of the talk, the word fitting. And the word fitting is not a very exalted term of moral philosophy, such as we're used to thinking about. It's not like, the just or the good or the beautiful. It sounds like something you do in a dressing room in a department store. Nonetheless, it is a really important term of moral guidance for a couple of reasons that I want to try to describe. So I'm using the word fitting to translate a Greek word, to prepon, which Aristotle uses to describe the just standard of human action. What do I try to do when I act? I try to do the just right thing from me toward the various persons that I'm acting with in all the circumstances of my life, at this time, in this place, and in this particular way. That is the standard of the fitting that I think should be the overall standard by means of which we guide our lives and which the intelligence for reading the world that a liberal education can draw out can make us better at perceiving. Okay, so let me give you a couple of examples to try to make what I mean by the fitting a little bit more clear. So first, something minor. It is, let's say it's your mother's birthday, and you wish to buy mom a fitting gift. So a gift that is fitting for mom is, of course, different than a gift that is fitting for dad, right? Like dad might like a nice leaf blower, and mom is probably not that into that. The appropriate gift has to be fitting from you to this person. So you might, your dad, for example, might get something for your mom that would be totally inappropriate coming for you, like a date night. Mom would probably think that was a little weird. It has to be appropriate to the place that you're in, right? So you don't want to give mom a really large gift while you're on vacation, something that she can't fit in her suitcase. It has to be appropriate to the particular time in which you give it. So like when you were a little kid, when you were 4, if you gave mom a nice crayon drawing of the two of you sitting under a tree having a picnic, she might have thought that was great, but you're 22 years old right now, and mom's thinking cashmere. So it's, the right thing has to be appropriate to time as well. Finally, there's the right manner. You want to give your gift in just the right way. You want to say just the right thing in the course of doing this. So that's the standard of the fitting. That's a series of questions that we ought to be asking in the choices that we make in our lives. I want to try to apply the standard of the fitting to a larger question now, the question of what job you might do when you graduate, which I know is on the minds of some of the people in this room. So let's just say you get an offer for a very remunerative, a well-paying, very prestigious job that sounds pretty good. Now, is it actually, there's plenty of wealth, there's plenty of prestige, but is it actually fitting for you? Would it take you across the country from all your friends and family? Would it involve you in living in a city that you hate? Would you be spending all your time in an office when you really would like to actually have some friends and maybe find somebody to marry? Those are the kinds of questions that you have to ask when you are investigating these kinds of questions. You have to ask, not just, is this job remunerative or is it prestigious, but is it fitting for me at the particular stage of life in which I find myself right now? Now, it is true, as the inner voice people say, that nobody can answer that question for you. It is, in fact, a question that you have to answer for yourself. But it is a question that can be articulated in this particular way that the standard of the fitting shows us. And it's a question that can be answered better when we cultivate the rational capacity for reading the world that we began discussing in the liberal arts classroom, and that I've tried to show can also be brought inside and into conversation with your particular desires. So that's the kind of work that I think a liberal education, rightly understood, should do for us, that we should do for ourselves through the course of this kind of education. So to close, I want to leave you all with 3 questions that I think it might be useful to think about on the basis of what we've thought about tonight. So first of all, if you're in the midst of college, are the classes that you're taking such as I described? Is the prof the sort of person that creates a game of interpretation among the students that leads them toward a better kind of friendship with one another? A friendship that values the capacity of the mind to read the world. If you are graduating, when you move on from here, who are you going to surround yourself with in life that brings those capacities out of you? And who are you going to reflect those capacities back to? How are you going to give that gift of love to other people? Second set of questions. What is the object of desire that most draws you on? Is it wealth, a husband or wife, reputation, a certain kind of career? Have you really taken your desire seriously? Have you taken it seriously enough to ask what it wants and whether what you're chasing could actually give you what you're asking for from it? In the way that Thomas Aquinas investigates the question of wealth. And finally, if I have a decision to make, a major decision about what I'm going to do with my life, or even a minor decision about what I'm going to give my mom for her birthday, am I assessing what I'm about to do in the light of the standard of the fitting? Am I asking the question, is this the right thing from me, for this person, at this time, in this place, and in this way? So as to make the best kind of decision that I can, and deploying the rational faculty for reading the world that liberal education ought to develop in answering those questions for myself. Okay, so that's the kind of liberal education that I think colleges and universities ought to be offering. I think that's the kind of thing that would help the young make their way through our chaotic world without being a prescription that just tells them what to do. And I hope that proves useful to you. So, Natalia, Colby, why don't we do our conversation? Go ahead.
Hello, folks. How are we doing? Looking forward to hearing your all questions here in just a little bit. But before we do that, I'm going to turn things over to Natalia. She can introduce herself and start some questions along.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalia Lopez. I'm a student here at the University of Florida. I'm a second-year student, and I'm majoring in political science and economics, and I'm also minoring in Spanish and business administration. So should we kick off the Q&A? Okay, so I want to focus in on your book, which everyone should read. It was a very worthwhile read. I found it...
In spite of the neon yellow cover, which I objected to deep in my soul, but could not stop.
So I found it fascinating how you took French theorist Montaigne, Pascal, Rousseau, and de Tocqueville, and you tie them all up to answer these timeless questions that we all have about the human experience, especially at such a pivotal point in our lives. So I want to narrow in on Montaigne and how you describe his theories, specifically imminent contentment, within the first couple chapters. And as I started reading, I became curious about like the philosophical genealogy of contentment, specifically how other philosophers such as Socrates address these broader questions. Now, there's a huge distinction between the two. So Montaigne derives this idea of contentment through the internal quest of really asking yourself, what makes me happy? Who am I? It's this internal battle with yourself and living this unbounded life, right? And Socrates takes a completely opposite approach through in the Republic through the construction of the ideal city, right? It's through pursuing your naturally suited talents in your prescribed role in society, right? We have the philosopher kings, the craftsmen, we have the guardian class. So my question to you, considering that Socrates confines contentment to these rigid class distinctions, and Montaigne is more on this internal desire for happiness that is upon ourselves, between these tensions, how do you see these conflicting in a society that sort of prioritizes external validation over this time for introspection?
Okay, so this is a very good question. I think one of the things that you'll notice is if you ever read the essays of Montaigne, how many people here have ever encountered this book? Just a couple. Okay, that's too bad. Montaigne is the inventor of the literary form known as the essay. So there's a verb in French, essayer, which means to try something out, to test it. And Montaigne is the first person to use that verb as a noun to refer to a literary form, the literary form of the essay. So next time one of your professors assigns you an essay and you don't enjoy writing it, blame Michel de Montaigne because he came up with this thing. So in Montaigne's essays, which are these wonderful, this wonderful 3 volumes of autobiographical writings that he produced at the end of the 16th century, one of the things that I think you'll notice in that book is that he actually makes Socrates into one of his heroes. And so when he looks at Socrates, he actually, there's a really funny line in there. He says, when Plato and Socrates, started talking about, the ideal city or the imagined republic or the laws and so on and so forth, he said they did it as a game. It was the least serious part of their work. The most serious part of their work, Montaigne says, was trying to live a good life, practicing things like Montaigne practices. So he tries to actually sort of close the gap between himself and Socrates. At the same time, I think he is genuinely, as you're suggesting, different from Socrates. Maybe less on the political differences, although we can talk about that if that's useful to you. But because Socrates asks the kinds of questions that I was just asking about wealth, like what is it? Can it make me happy? Montaigne doesn't ask those kinds of questions because he doesn't think there are any sort of essences to things. So it's all highly individualistic in that particular book, whereas the Socratic way of doing things involves what are sometimes called the forms, the substances of things, that they're natures that we try to understand and use in our efforts to navigate the world. So in this sense, I think Montaigne and Socrates are indeed different in the way that you're describing.
Yeah, so being a part of AEI just for the past year, most of the people who come through this program, you can just tell are go-getters. People who just want to go out and take the world and just grab it and take and get as much out of it as they possibly can. In the book, you discuss Blaise Pascal and Rousseau, and there's somewhat opposing views on idleness and solitude. And if idleness and like fixedness, being set in one place, is the opposite of restlessness, is that really what we're going for? I'm certain it's not. Like that can't be the answer, because when you're a 45-year-old who's in venture capital and you go in and you retire and you're like, I'm going to play golf every day for the rest of my life.
How depressing.
Right, and then 6 months in, you're like, I can't play golf anymore. It's done. I'm over. And what am I supposed to do? So if we don't want to be idle and we also don't want to be restless,
Yes.
what are we to do?
Okay, a really good question. All right, so when you write a book called Why We Are Restless, everybody assumes that restlessness is, well, if restlessness is wrong, then rest is right. That's what we should be aiming at: peace, inner contentment, and so on and so forth. And this is a question that in a way lots of people have proposed to us. What we're trying to describe in this book as restlessness is, frankly, I think you all are probably familiar with it from your lives on campus, right? So what does campus encourage you to do with yourself, right? You show up and they tell you, like, hey, 2 majors, 3 majors. This is wonderful. We can do that for you if you wish to, study both, political science and ancient Urdu. This is something that we can work out. They encourage you to study abroad. Not just study abroad in one place, but maybe study abroad in 2 places or even 3 places. I knew one student who studied abroad in both India and Denmark, which I thought was a really interesting combination. They tell you, you can, we've got, when you do the campus tours, they tell you about all the clubs they have. Like, I looked at some, the website of one of these big universities the other day, and it was like over 1,000 clubs, right? It's, and so, what this works out to in the lives of students is you run from one thing to another, right? College, skole. Has anybody ever, the etymology of the word school is this ancient Greek word skole. You know what the Greek word skole means? It means leisure. Most of my college students did not feel like they were at leisure. They felt like sweaty, harried people running from one thing to the next. And the thing that we discovered, after talking to many of these people over the course of their college careers, is they would just spend all this time running around and not actually gain anything that helped them navigate their lives. They would be more confused when they graduated than they were when they arrived. And I'm not talking about bad students. I'm talking about really good students would end up in this kind of predicament. So restlessness, as we describe it, is this kind of frenetic activity when you're going from thing to thing to thing, but you're not really going much anywhere in the course of all this. And what we want to distinguish that from is not rest, not just, one of the philosophers we talk about in the book is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who described, his happiness as like sitting around in a Genevan lake, floating in a boat, just looking at the sky. And look, that might be nice for an afternoon, but I don't think I don't think it should be the center of a way of life. The genuine alternative to restlessness is the pointed quest, right? I'm not just moving from thing to thing to thing because all of them are vaguely a little bit attractive. I'm working through life very attentively to interrogate the question of what might make me happy. And so I give you one version of that interrogation in the talk tonight. I'll give you one other example of it, which is the example of Blaise Pascal, who's the second author that we talk about in this book. And Pascal was an absolutely astonishing polymath who is a world historical figure in science, in mathematics, in any number of different fields. And so here's the thing. By the time he was in his 20s, he had written books about geometry and mathematics and physics that are still read today. He lived in the 17th century. He'd made world historic contribution to those sciences. And then he said, you know what? It's not really any good. It doesn't actually make me happy. And so he moved on, started thinking about religious questions, started thinking about philosophic questions, and burned his way through these things in this very intense manner of his. We should be more like Pascal. That is, more attentive to asking the hard question of whether the sorts of things I'm doing actually contribute to happiness and just what measure they do so. And if they're not very important, we should stop doing them.
Thank you.
So I actually wanted to touch a little bit on the idea of the pointed quest. So my next question ties my favorite quote from the book. It's on the last page if anyone has the copy with them. It says, "The art of choosing cannot bring our restless heart to a standstill, but it may help turn our pointless busyness into a pointed quest."
Yeah.
So we live in a society that has designed modern commodities with the complete intention of detaching us from reality, right? I mean, if you look on campus, I guarantee you the majority of students are walking around with headphones or AirPods on, scrolling on their phones. And we've seen this bleed down into younger generations where a default parenting strategy is handing your kid an iPad, right? Constantly distracting them. And this is very bad, right? we're teaching kids from a young age that we're living in this false reality of constant detachment. And I think that it has contributed to the reason why Gen Z is facing horrible things such as increased mental health issues, an exorbitantly high suicide rate, especially in the post-COVID era. And we can attack big tech and we can wage a war against Silicon Valley, but at the end of the day, the damage has been done, right? And change needs to happen. So I'm thinking more on an atomized individual level. How can we make time for this type of introspection in a society that has already been designed to keep us detached, right?
Take a Sabbath. Years ago, I was an ambitious young academic, and I worked 7 days a week when my family was really little, and so on and so forth. And at some point, my wife and I, we read a book by Abraham Joshua Heschel. It's called The Sabbath. It's about 100 pages. One of the most extraordinary books I've ever read. It talks about the sanctification of time. That's the theme of that book, the sanctification of time. He describes Judaism as a religion that is, he thinks of other religions as sanctifying spaces, right? Like, a church is a sacred space in a certain sense. He says Judaism sanctifies time by prizing the Sabbath in the way that it does. So there's a lot of the stuff that you're describing, like I can't not look at email on a work day, or not on most work days. I have to check in. But I don't have to do it all the time. And taking a day a week to just turn all this stuff off and walk away from it is an extraordinarily powerful thing. When I was on vacation this past summer, I was in France, and my phone got stolen. And at the end of the day, it was great. Because, I got a cheap phone to get around in France or whatever, but it wasn't interesting. And I started seeing the world. And I started paying attention better to my children and my wife. And I calmed down. It's funny, your mind is constantly working at this kind of frenetic pace. A lot of that is involved with the screens and so on and so forth. You can turn this stuff off. So this is a rich vein that you've mined here. There's these wonderful people in my neighborhood who they signed a bunch of us parents up for this thing they call the Postman Pledge. It's named after this guy named Neil Postman, who wrote this book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And what we do in the Postman Pledge is we pledge not to give our children smartphones until they're at least 14, maybe 18. My kids don't have them. My oldest is 17. She doesn't have one. But instead of just taking technology away from them, we do other stuff instead. So we have picnics with family soccer games. I sprained my ankle at the last one. It was really bad. We have Scottish dances. Those are the best. You do all these old style dances where everybody's going up and down a line and all these kinds of things. It's very Jane Austen. And it's just but that's the wonderful thing about it, right? Don't just say no to technology. Say yes to something better than that. Game nights and so on and so forth. And this has just been a wonderful thing. So the dances. The young men and the young women in high school, they get to court. They get to, start to check one another out. But the parents are there. The little kids are there. It's not, some weird fraternity house with, blinking purple lights and all kinds of stuff. And, it's a relatively salubrious environment. And so there's lots of things that people do that are actually, I think, very effective that can dumb the stuff down in your life, or not dumb the stuff down, that can give you some space from this stuff in your life.
How often do you think we should be bored?
Boredom is so two French authors on boredom. The first is this novelist called Michel Houellebecq. Have any of you ever heard of this guy? Okay. These two guys. Okay, you guys know about Houellebecq. The books are terrible. They're just salacious and awful, but they're also very profound. And you shouldn't read them because there are other things that are profound and aren't so salacious and awful. Anyway.
Ringing endorsement.
All right. So there was an interview with Michel Houellebecq, who is, at the end of the day, a very gifted novelist. And he was describing how he writes. And he said, je m'ennuie un peu et il vient. I get a little bored and it comes. Think about that. When you're trying to think, this is the worst thing about trying to write on a computer. When you get a little bored, what do? You scroll, right? You Google something, right? You check your email. No, the boredom is essential. You have to have the boredom. And it's painful, but that's when the good stuff comes. So another thinker on boredom is Blaise Pascal, who we deal with in this book. And one of the most famous fragments of the Pensées, he says, the whole reason that human beings are unhappy is because they can't sit alone in a room. Try it sometime. Sit there by yourself in silence. See how long you can make it. Yeah, it's pretty tough. But it's liberating if you actually learn to do it. And then Pascal asks, why do we hate silence and solitude so much? He says because when we're alone and quiet, well, we face certain facts about ourselves. We face the fact that we love life, we're going to die, we want to know things, and we're irretrievably ignorant. We want to be good and maybe even holy, and we know ourselves to be flawed and sinful, and we run away from that stuff. And so, and all of us, we have these incredibly powerful distraction devices on our persons all the time. It's insane. So, but Pascal thinks sitting alone in a room is the key, right? It's the key to understanding the question of human life, because you are in fact mortal and flawed and much less capable of knowing things than you would like to be. All that is just totally true about us. So what are you going to do in the light of that fact? How are you going to live your life? That's the real question of a human life. And we never even encounter it if we just, do like I'm as tempted to do as anybody else. Scroll stuff the moment we're alone for a second.
So one of the surprises to me in this book is that I think underneath the surface, it's actually a really great critique of liberalism and of democracy. And you talk about in the book how the democratization of America and has caused what you call dissolving the web of permanence and how we don't adhere to each other anymore. And so I wonder what that does to a democratic society. I wonder if we detach from the common problems that we have and focus on our personal problems, is that a danger to American life? I guess at the core of my question, I want to ask, is it essential that we reconcile us to ourselves before we reconcile ourselves to others? Does it have to go in that order, or can you do them in tandem?
That's a great question. The book has been described a couple times as a critique of liberalism, but that's not entirely how we intended it. Actually, I find that, are you all aware of the liberalism debates? These people who are arguing they're liberals and post-liberals, anti-liberals, so on and so forth. A lot of this stuff. These debates are very hot in young people Washington circles. So if you're amused by this kind of stuff, come to DC. I think those debates. That's actually the wrong question. This is something that my colleague at AEI, Yuval Levin, says. Most of the things that we think of as an excess of liberalism are actually a defect of republicanism. I think that's a really nice way to formulate what's going wrong with American life. That is, we feel isolated and atomized and like we're living in an anti-culture, which is the phrase of Patrick Deneen, and that what I think is the sharpest chapter of his book, Why Liberalism Failed. And I don't think liberalism has failed, but that's what Patrick thinks, and he got a lot of people's attention with that book. I think a lot of the reason that we feel that way is because we're so little engaged in the civic life of this country. And so, if you read the best book about democracy and best book about America ever written, Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, Tocqueville celebrates the little New England town. And what's wonderful about the little New England town is, you've just got a handful of people there, and all these little political offices by means of which they take care of all the business of their community. And what Tocqueville loves about this is that it stretches people. It takes them outside of themselves. It makes them larger than they would otherwise be, because they actually come to care for the common good. And the way you come to care for the common good is not by reading a philosophic book that tells you how great it is. The way that you come to care for the common good is by actually doing work on its behalf in common. And so what liberalism, I think, or let me put this differently. What American constitutional government does for us that is great, and this again is in the words of my colleague Yuval Levin, is it allows us to act together without thinking alike. I don't think human beings have ever all thought alike. I think you can, fundamental disagreements about everything are at least as old as the ancient Greek cities, and actually they're as old as human beings. I'm almost certain of that. But acting together is still possible, and that's what actually makes human beings feel like they have something common with one another when they do something together. So, working on a university faculty, I was frequently shoved onto committees with people I didn't very much like and I didn't agree with at all. Nonetheless, we actually found that we could do things together. We actually found that we could get stuff done. And it was actually kind of fun to be with those people in that way. And so in this sense, I don't think that whatever the concerns about excesses of liberal society that many of us may have, I don't think the answer to that is like to go back to the 13th century, which some of my friends actually think. I think the answer to that is to sort of lean into the best elements of the constitutional system that we have, and remember that the founders of this country didn't describe it either as a democracy or as liberal. They described it as a constitutional republic. And actually understanding that difference and understanding that constitutional republicanism demands things of us. It asks things of us. It wants us to be engaged in a way that we're not normally engaged. Well, that would be a good start as to dealing with our political problems.
Go back home and do good things, always. Right. All right, we will open it up to questions here if we have any. We'll go ahead and start up here, and we'll move our way around.
So that's Evan Huck, who was in the last first-year seminar class I taught at Furman. And it was that class of people that I described, scrolling on their smartphones, and sort of he was one of the guys with a smartphone. No,
maybe. But I was just say I liked your comment on how we have like a lot of potentiality, but don't make it into actuality.
Yeah.
And I find a reason for that is that in today's age, we want, like you said, we want to find our true self, but we can only have the ideal job, and nothing else. We have to have the ideal job and the perfect fit. We want the ideal. And do you think that there's ways that we can get people to stop being in that mindset that we have to find perfect and just, I guess, find things to try to make things work, and not everything has to be perfect?
Yeah, I don't think the ideal job exists. I have like an astonishingly wonderful job, and I'm grateful for it every single day, but it's not perfect. There are no students at AEI, and that's, as I mentioned, that's I like students. I mean, it's fun to have them around, and so this is in this sense, yeah, I think looking for the ideal job is just a fool's errand. But the suitable job, the fitting job, well, that's a reasonable standard. What's the kind of work that actually allows me to bring out the good in other human beings? That might actually be really satisfying kind of work. And so in this sense, I don't know if there are other places that we can take this, but the kind of work that jobs are jobs. They're never ideal. In other words, an employer wants you to do some certain thing, and that certain thing never matches every dimension of your human nature. That's just not possible. And so in this sense, no job can be a job can never be a fitting answer to the question of human happiness, right? It can be an important part of your life, but it does not speak to every dimension of your or any other human soul. And so, one has to ask, what are the other dimensions of human happiness? Give those a place, and ask work for something more limited, which it might actually be able to give.
We'll go up here, and then we'll move this way.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us today.
Yeah.
I wanted to speak more on the institutional factors of liberal arts education and how exactly that can be, in itself institutionalized, and pointing to your own experience as a professor and the move outside of that career.
Yeah.
So did you feel that when you left that career that your students were still left in good hands of another professor in that institution itself, to still see themselves as free thinkers and approach life in a way that liberal arts education should have them approach life? Or do you feel that because a lot of it can be left up to chance for a professor to approach it, that those students themselves are left up to chance?
But there were a number of really good people there. When I left, in fact, one of them has actually since moved here. A guy named Aaron Zubia, who was working at Furman when I left, and there's some other people who have taken up the reins of things there, who I think are very gifted teachers. But the kind of work that I try to describe, the chaste but loving engagement of a professor with his or her students, that is a very rare and precious thing that institutions don't really recognize or know how to value or institutionalize. And a lot of institutions actually make doing that kind of work more difficult in a lot of ways. I had a very interesting conversation with a couple of professors in the Hamilton Center earlier today. And they were describing the distinctive kind of attention that they're going to give to undergraduate education as part of this program. A lot of times, undergraduate education, even in a liberal arts college, people say this is what one of these guys was pointing out to me today. People use this dumb mantra that your research grows out of your teaching, which is a reason to enslave your teaching to your research, right? And when your research doesn't grow out of your teaching, if you're a researcher, you're supposed to be like becoming a very profound expert in some particular subject. Your students often need the basics, they need like square one. I was a history major as an undergraduate, and the history major was structured upside down. We were required to take specialized upper level courses because that was useful to the professor's research and they wanted to fill those classes. We weren't required to take lower level general courses, which is what we as students actually needed. And so there was, one of the things that I hope for, this is the thing, liberal education could just go away. There are not a lot of people who love it in this country right now. And it's not eternal. it's not something that we should just take as guaranteed. And I think that the academic world needs to recognize the fact that what they have is an exceedingly precious good. And you have to make the case for it in every generation. That's what I'm trying to do in the things that I'm talking about with you all tonight. It's like, look, what can this do for you? What is special about what goes on in the liberal arts classroom? And I think that colleges and universities should recognize that they've got something very rare and precious in this and give all the institutional support to it that they can.
Very nice. We'll go back here and then circle our way around this table, I think.
Hello. Your question on, or of Dr. Storey about critique of liberalism got me thinking about a book I read by Charles Taylor, The Ethics of Authenticity, this week. And he makes the point that sort of a lot of critics of modern society and its ills, attack ways of living that he associates with or identifies as trying to cohere with the ideal of authenticity, which, if you do proper intellectual history, is a product of primarily German romantics and not, say, Scottish liberal Enlightenment philosophers. And so I'm curious, Dr. Storey, to what extent you think, intellectual history could remedy this newfound and slightly disturbing distaste for liberalism?
It could do one thing that I've found really helpful is, actually, we've been doing this little reading group among some scholars at AEI, and we've been reading stuff written in the 1970s. And the 1970s is one of those decades that many people think of as just something you'd better off forget, right? The fashions were bad, the hair was bad, disco. It was, but it is totally fascinating to read this stuff. It's fascinating because a lot, I'm thinking of some of the, great works of a lot of scholars associated with AEI, people like Irving Kristol, for example. Many of the questions they were asking in the 1970s were exactly the same as the questions that we're asking right now. And I think that's one of the things that we don't see in our arguments about liberalism. Like the post-liberals, the people who are arguing against liberalism, they seem to feel like they are the first people to stumble across these arguments. These arguments have been around for a very long time. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is one of the origins of them. And, he wrote in 1754 was when his, highest period of productivity began. You can find a lot of these arguments in Alexis de Tocqueville. You can find them in Friedrich Nietzsche. You can find them in any number of thinkers over the course of our history. So, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about right now, it has been talked about before. And often in exactly the same words. And so I think it is, I think it's very useful to do intellectual history in this sense, and can help us sober up about just whether what we're, the discontent we're feeling with our own social order is actually anything new or particularly justified. I think I'll. Was there a particular question about authenticity that you wanted to raise there? I caught the bit about intellectual history, but that's a different thing.
Yes, I suppose. Do you think it's it's a defect of liberalism, or it is a proper intellectual history would expose that it's a German thing?
Oh, well, I think it's French, but that's because I study French things. Maybe it's German. I don't know. I do think that the thinkers that have most helped me understand the ideal of authenticity are French thinkers like Montaigne and Rousseau. That's why I say I think it's French, because I think you can see what we're after in this from those people, and you can find that genealogy in a book like Lionel Trilling's The Ethics of Authenticity. Excuse me, not The Ethics of Authenticity. Sincerity and Authenticity is his particular book on this. I think authenticity is just a misguided ideal. I think it's that ideal of the inner self, or the inner voice that I was trying to describe for you earlier. I don't think that's a proper way to navigate the world. I think we do better by asking about the substantive character of the things that we desire and interrogating whether those things can actually make us happy in the way that I tried to describe for you in the talk. So in this sense, and in some ways, the view that I'm trying to describe there, like I used Thomas Aquinas, or I could use Plato or Aristotle as thinkers who take this kind of approach. Those thinkers live outside the framework of liberalism. But the great thing about liberalism is that you don't have to be a liberal philosophically to be a liberal politically. You can think whatever you want about the highest good, and live a perfectly peaceful, reasonable, productive, happy, useful to your neighbors kind of life in a political order like ours. So in that sense, I think a lot of the tools of an older kind of philosophy are actually really helpful to living a good life in a constitutional Republican world in a way that we don't often recognize.
Great. Yeah, we will go up here, and in the meantime, we will appreciate Bee Gees, the bell bottoms, and floral tops of the 70s.
Okay.
I don't think we can let that go. All right, anyway, right here.
All right, this will be the last question we have time for
Gotcha.
tonight.
Your titular theme of restlessness very much reminded me of the dialogue between Socrates and Callicles and Gorgias.
Yeah.
And that Socrates' ultimate argument that there's a difference between pleasure and good, between experience and art. So my question is very straightforward. What insight can you give us on how to discipline ourselves such that we consume more of the good than the pleasurable, that we consume more of art than experience? Because to me, this seems ultimately like a very existentialist type of challenge.
So the question, let me see if I have the question right. How can we encourage ourselves to pursue the good rather than the pleasant? Is that right?
Find the motivation.
Oh, find the motivation. Okay. A couple of things. My daughter's 8th grade teacher began class this year by having the kids enact a medieval funeral. And they carried one of their classmates out of class, and they buried him in the mulch of the garden because he was the dead guy. And this teacher's a very genius man. And his point in doing this with 13-year-old kids was to get them to think about the fact that they're mortal. Get them to think about the fact that they're going to die. And they're in their last year of middle school. And he asked them, after he did this little exercise, he said, well, what do you want your legacy to be in this place? And then he asked them, what do you think your legacy is likely to be in this place? How are you going to be remembered here? And a lot of the boys who I know from the Boy Scout troop who are total goof-offs, they are just looking at their shoes like, oh, yeah. I mean, you'd be remembered as this obnoxious person. And it was really helpful. It was sobering for these kids to start to think about the kinds of things that one might do in life that were not simply self-indulgent pleasures, and the inadequacy of self-indulgent pleasures to people who actually face the fact of their own mortality. And so one thing that we can do is remember this fact of our own mortality. The other thing that we can do is, if you think about the moments of greatest satisfaction in your own life, I think you'll find that in most of those moments, you are not pursuing pleasure. So, for example, it's fun for me to. My oldest daughter is a good piano player. It's fun for me to watch her play, and or dance. She's also a good ballet dancer, and that's what she's been concentrating on lately. She is totally involved in what she's doing when she's dancing. She's not thinking about anything else in the world than where she's going to stick her toe in the next movement that she has to perform. And it is the greatest joy in the world to her. It's like, it's not, you would never do this stuff if you were seeking pleasure. It's very physically difficult. But that's the kind of stuff that human beings enjoy most. And so, the cultivation of your own capacities, the capacity to make great music or to play a sport very well or so on. That's the stuff where human beings actually find genuine happiness in life. Aristotle called it activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. That's the thing that is the genuine source of human happiness. And I think once you know that and you experience it a little bit, look, pleasures are pleasures. People are going to be, attracted to them from time to time. But once you've had some of that stuff, you know that, the pleasures of the body, even the trivial pleasures of the mind, these things are not really what's best in human life. So immerse yourself in the really deeply satisfying things, which tend to be very hard. And I think the rest will come of itself.
Activity in the soul in accordance with virtue. If that's not a word to end off on, then I don't know what will. Will you all think? Will you all think Dr. Ben Storey with me?
Thank you all.
And while we're in the spirit of clapping for folks, I would like to thank all of the academic program staff for putting this on for us. It has been a wonderful conference. And thank you all for doing it with me. It's been a wonderful senior conference. I have no doubt that all of you are going to go out and make wonderful additions and changes in the world, and I've never been more excited than I am right now. So I'll turn it over to Jeff.
All right, on that note, with Colby doing my job for me, no, seriously, thank you, Colby, Ben, and Natalia for an awesome conclusion to this spring summit. Please give them a round of applause. Okay, so a couple of closing announcements. First, do I need to hold it up? Can you not hear me? Is that better? Okay. Uh-oh, it's coming undone. All right. First, if you've had a good time at this summit and you've been to one of our events before, you know what I'm about to say. You've had a good time because people who attended something like this before you filled out a survey when we sent it to them, and we were able to learn and plan accordingly. And if that's not motivation enough for our Collegiate Network students, you also must, somebody say this next part with me, fill out the survey in order to get what? Reimbursed. There you go. So that's all I need to say about that. For those of you who are here, really our hosts, for those of you who are Florida Gators, thank you again for letting us come to your beautiful campus in this really nice weather for the month of February. And we are also going to send you a survey because we'd love to know what you thought, and we'd love to stay in touch with you. And so be on the lookout for that in the next week or so. Hotel checkout tomorrow, anything they need to know about that, our students? At 11, okay. So hotel checkout is at 11. Our time has wrapped up here in this room, and so you don't have to wrap up the conversations with one another, but you do have to take them somewhere else besides here. Again, we have had a wonderful time, and I appreciate Colby thanking the academic program staff, but I will take another point of personal privilege to do that as well. So Katya, Juan, Walker, Allie, Kate, Lauren, and our intern Leah, we are so grateful for all of your efforts leading up to this weekend, but I'd be remiss if I didn't highlight especially our associate Camille Messer, who took the lead from our team in putting this together. So thank you, Camille. And thank you also to Will Inboden and Robert Ingram, as well as James and his colleague, who's not here because his family just grew this week. Drayton, huge thank you, especially to James, and please pass it on to Drayton as well. We could not have done this without them, so y'all give them a round of applause as well. Okay, Camille, Katya, any other announcements? Okay, so Before we officially wrap, I do just want to remind you that we've got a couple weeks left for this 2024 Summer Honors Program. And so if you have not applied, we would really, really encourage you to do that. It is our flagship program that we do all year, and it's the engine from which our collegiate network runs. So Allie, Kate, Lauren, and Juan all have flyers. So find them, grab a flyer. You can see the course list and more information there. The application's open, and do not be intimidated by it at all. So for those of you who are, maybe they should be intimidated by it, is this what you're laughing about? Well, okay, this is a smidge of intimidation. I'm just saying you can do it in 2 weeks. How about that? That's very true. Okay. So for those of you who are collegiate network students, you're here because we invited you, you're graduating seniors. And when you walk the stage at graduation, you may find, like I did, that there will be some competing feelings of accomplishment and vulnerability. Because the college graduation is an interesting thing because it's an achievement that then gives license to like everyone in your life to ask you what you're going to do next. And that, as we've discussed in many different ways, can be quite daunting. So as questions like that come your way, I'd like to leave you with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite C.S. Lewis sermons called Learning in Wartime. Happy work is best done by the man who takes his long-term plans somewhat lightly. It is only our daily bread we are encouraged to ask for. The present is the only time in which any duty can be done or any grace received. And so may it be with each of you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being involved with AEI, and we'll see you on the other side.